I remember the first night I noticed something off about my neighbor. It was early fall, around that strange hour when the world goes completely quiet. No cars, no wind, no movement. I'd been awake scrolling through my phone, light from the screen casting a dull glow across my room. That's when I saw a figure outside, standing completely still near my backyard fence. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows. The street light flickered, and for a second I convinced myself it was just a mailbox or a tree. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my window. I pulled the curtain back a little, heart pounding in that slow, uncertain way it does when you're not sure if you should be afraid yet. The figure didn't flinch. I could make out the outline of a sweatshirt hood and the faint glint of glasses under the porch light. My phone screen dimmed, and suddenly the reflection of his face was all I could see in the glass, expressionless, eyes locked right where I was standing. I turned off my light immediately, stepping back into the corner of my room. My house was small, one of those older suburban homes built close together so I could see directly into the neighbor's yard from my window. I waited for the shape to move, but it stayed there, still as ever. I didn't know if he could see me through the glass, but I could feel him watching. After what felt like forever, I grabbed my phone and texted my friend Tyler, who lived 2 houses down. "Hey, are you awake?" "There's someone in my backyard," he replied instantly. "Check if it's your neighbor." "The guy with the gray hoodie?" I froze. That's exactly what the figure was wearing. I looked again, this time more carefully. The way he stood, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly upward, almost looked like he was expecting something, like he wasn't there by mistake. My porch light flickered once, and in that second, his face became visible. It was definitely my neighbor, Mr. Carter. I didn't know what to do. Mr. Carter was in his mid-40s, quiet, lived alone, and barely spoke to anyone. I'd waved to him maybe twice since moving in, but there he was at 3 in the morning, just watching. I thought maybe he was drunk or confused. I wanted to call out to him, but my throat felt locked. Then I realized something strange. He wasn't facing the window directly anymore. His body was turned slightly toward the side gate, like he was listening. The longer I stared, the more I noticed. His chest wasn't rising or falling. He wasn't breathing. Or if he was, I couldn't see it. I blinked, and he was gone. Not like he'd walked away, not like he'd ducked behind something, just gone. The yard looked empty again, silent and still. I ran downstairs, turned on every light, and checked through the blinds. Nothing, just my yard, and that faint rustle of wind that hadn't been there before. The next morning, I tried convincing myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been tired, half asleep, and mistaken the shadows for something else. But when I stepped outside for work, I noticed footprints in the damp grass, deep, uneven ones leading right up to the spot where he'd stood. My stomach tightened. The ground was dry everywhere else. I walked over, half expecting to find more tracks, but they just stopped there. No trail back to the fence or the street. It was like he'd appeared and vanished in that single patch of grass. I looked up toward his house across the narrow yard. Curtains shut, no sign of movement. Still, I felt watched. That evening I tried to brush it off, made dinner, turned on the TV, told myself not to check the window. Around midnight I finally gave in. I peeked outside and froze. The same faint outline was standing in the exact same spot, head tilted just slightly upward, facing my bedroom window again. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and started recording. The image was grainy, but it was clear enough to make out the gray hoodie. For a few seconds he didn't move, not even a twitch. Then, as if he could sense he was being filmed, his head turned directly toward my camera. I dropped the phone. When I looked back, he was walking slowly toward the fence that divided our yards. He stopped, placed a hand on one of the wooden boards, and leaned forward as if listening through it. Then he stepped back into the darkness and disappeared again. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, the pipes, the creak of the house, felt deliberate. The next morning, I went to his house. I needed to know what the hell was happening. I knocked once, then again. Nothing. Finally, I saw a small envelope taped to his door. My name was written on it in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper that said, "Don't let him in again." I didn't understand what that meant. Him? Mr. Carter lived alone. When I peered through his window, the house looked untouched. Furniture covered with sheets, layers of dust everywhere. I asked a mail carrier walking by if the guy still lived there. He said the house had been vacant for months. That night, I reviewed the video I'd recorded on my phone. The timestamp was right, 3 a.m., but something about it made my chest tighten. The figure in the footage wasn't wearing a hoodie anymore. It was wearing my jacket. And when it turned toward the camera, the face was blurry, almost identical to mine. I locked every door, every window, double-checked every latch. Then, for the first time since moving there, I slept with the light on. But sometime around 3 again, I woke up to the faint sound of someone walking through the grass outside my window. Slow, deliberate steps, like they'd been waiting for me to wake up. I didn't even want to look this time. I lay there, frozen under the covers, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight on my ceiling. The footsteps stopped right beneath my window. Then there was silence. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I slowly turned my head toward the blinds, afraid of what might be on the other side. The slats of the blinds shifted slightly, like someone brushed them from outside. Just one small movement, enough to make me stop breathing. I sat up, grabbed my phone, and hit record again. My voice shook as I whispered into the mic that someone was outside my window for the 3rd night in a row. Then with shaking hands, I reached for the cord and pulled the blinds open. No one was there, just the empty yard, still and quiet. But then from the corner of my screen I noticed something that made my hands go numb. My reflection in the glass wasn't moving the same way I was. It was still looking toward the yard while I had already turned away. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone onto the carpet. The recording continued, capturing nothing but the faint hum of air and my shaky breathing. I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it toward the yard, and saw the footprints again. Fresh ones, leading closer this time. They stopped right beneath the window frame, and near the bottom edge of the siding, I saw something small pressed into the dirt. A piece of paper. I opened the back door slowly, every instinct telling me not to go out. The night air was colder than it should have been, and the silence felt heavier. I crouched down, picked up the paper, and saw the same shaky handwriting as before. It said, "He knows you saw him." My throat went dry. I backed toward the door, flashlight trembling in my hand. Then I caught movement at the far end of the yard. A figure stepped out from behind the fence, wearing my same clothes, my same shoes, even the same faint tear in the jacket sleeve I'd noticed earlier. I dropped the light. I ran inside, slammed the door, and locked it. Through the window blinds, I could still see him standing there, me, just outside, perfectly still, watching. I called 911, but the words felt stuck in my mouth. When I finally managed to explain, they said they'd send someone. By the time the patrol car arrived, the yard was empty again. No footprints, no figure, no note. For a few weeks, things went quiet. I started sleeping again, convinced I'd been imagining it. Or maybe it was someone messing with me. Then one night, as I brushed my teeth before bed, I noticed something in the mirror behind me. Something small, almost easy to miss. My bedroom curtain was slightly open. I hadn't touched it. I walked over, half afraid to look, half too curious not to. Outside, the yard was empty. But in the faint reflection of the glass, I saw him again, my neighbor, my reflection, whatever it was, standing behind me, eyes fixed on the window like he'd been waiting for me to notice. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I remember the night my aunt said she saw our neighbor standing in our kitchen. She was visiting for a few days while my parents were away, just keeping me company in our quiet suburban house. It was a normal Friday evening. Movies, popcorn, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, around midnight, she came into my room looking pale, whispering that someone had been standing by the sink. At first, I thought she was half asleep or just confused by the reflection from the window. Our kitchen faced the backyard, and sometimes shadows from the motion light made strange shapes on the glass. I walked with her to check, expecting nothing. But when I turned on the light, the back door was slightly open, just enough to move with the draft. I closed it, trying to stay calm. The lock was still latched, but the handle felt cold, like someone had been gripping it recently. My aunt insisted she'd seen our neighbor, Mr. Harlan, just standing there. He lived 2 houses down, always polite but quiet. I didn't say it out loud, but I'd noticed him staring at our house a few times before. We double-checked the windows and doors, then went back to the living room. My aunt couldn't shake it off, though. She kept glancing toward the kitchen like she expected someone to walk through again. I tried to reassure her, saying maybe it was a trick of the light or her imagination. She nodded but didn't look convinced. After she went to bed, I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard something small, a clink, like metal tapping against a counter. I froze, listening. It came again, soft but distinct from the direction of the kitchen. I stood slowly and peeked around the corner. Nothing. The sound stopped the second I looked. I waited there for a minute, barely breathing, then walked over. Everything looked normal. Clean counters, sink empty, drawers closed. But one thing caught my eye. The dish towel hanging on the oven handle was gone. I didn't think much of it until I noticed the faint smell of detergent, like freshly washed hands. Trying to calm myself, I turned off the lights and headed upstairs. But as I passed the dining room, I noticed something strange through the glass door leading outside. There were faint marks on the patio, shoe prints, spaced evenly, like someone had been standing perfectly still for a while. I locked the door again, checked it twice, and finally went to bed. My aunt was still awake, sitting up in the guest room, asking if I'd seen him again. I told her no, trying to sound certain. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever she saw wasn't just a trick of the shadows. Someone really had been in our kitchen that night. The next morning, sunlight made everything feel less threatening. My aunt laughed off what happened, saying maybe she'd been half dreaming. I wanted to believe her. But when I went into the kitchen to make breakfast, I noticed something immediately. The drawer that held our utensils was half open. Inside, it looked emptier than usual. I counted them out of curiosity. 3 forks, 1 spoon, and a single butter knife were missing. My aunt hadn't touched them, and I hadn't cooked anything that would have needed them. I checked the dishwasher, the sink, even the trash. They were gone. That small, unexplainable detail made the air feel heavy again. I walked outside to check the backyard. The grass was damp from the morning dew, but near the patio, the footprints from last night were still faintly visible. They led toward the fence separating our yard from Mr. Harlan's. His curtains were drawn, but I could feel eyes behind them, watching. When I came back in, my aunt was standing near the kitchen window, her face tense. "He's outside," she whispered. I followed her gaze and saw him, Mr. Harlan, standing by his trash bins, staring directly at our house. Not moving, not pretending to be busy, just staring. When he noticed me looking, he turned and slowly walked back inside. That was the moment it stopped feeling like paranoia. My aunt wanted to call the police, but what would we even say? Our neighbor might have stolen some forks? It sounded ridiculous. So instead, we just stayed close together, keeping the doors locked, pretending everything was fine. But I kept glancing at that open utensil drawer. That night, after my aunt went to bed, I stayed downstairs. I wanted to see if anything else strange would happen. Around midnight, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards near the back door, the same sound that had woken my aunt the night before. I turned off the TV and sat still, listening. The sound moved slowly, like someone testing each step. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling, and crept toward the kitchen. When I peeked around the corner, I saw movement, a faint silhouette passing by the window, just tall enough to match Mr. Harlan's frame. Then came another noise, the soft metallic clatter of something being dropped outside. I ran to the back door and switched on the porch light, but by the time I did, the yard was empty. The gate was slightly open, swaying in the wind. I looked down and saw what had made the sound. One of our missing forks lying on the steps, perfectly clean, like it had been placed there. The next morning, my aunt was pale and quiet. She didn't ask why one of our forks was sitting outside. She already knew. We both avoided the kitchen, as if the walls there held a secret we didn't want to hear. I thought about calling the police again, but something in me hesitated. What if we were overreacting? What if we made things worse by drawing attention? By evening, Mr. Harlan's blinds were still closed. No movement, no sign of him outside. But just after sunset, I noticed something strange through the window. His kitchen light flickered on, then off again, like someone had walked by the switch. My aunt saw it too. "He's not home," she whispered, clutching her mug tightly. "I saw him drive away earlier." We stared across the yards in silence, both thinking the same thing but not saying it out loud. Someone was inside his house, or maybe he never left. The air in our kitchen felt colder than it should have. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder, almost intrusive. That was when I realized how quiet everything outside had become. Not a single cricket. That night, my aunt insisted we sleep downstairs, closer to the front door, just in case. We pulled a blanket onto the couch and tried to distract ourselves with an old movie, but halfway through, we heard it again, a faint metallic scrape. This time, it was coming from inside the house. I froze, scanning the room. The sound was coming from the kitchen, steady and deliberate, like someone rummaging through drawers. My aunt whispered, "Call the police," but before I could move, the noise stopped. For a few seconds, the house was dead silent. Then came the soft sound of something hitting the tile floor, a spoon. I gathered enough courage to peer into the kitchen. The drawer that had been half open before was now wide open. And sitting right on the counter was every missing utensil, neatly arranged in a row. The window above the sink was also open, curtains swaying in the cold breeze. We locked the window and waited for the police. But when they came, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing at all. Mr. Harlan wasn't home either, according to them. His place was dark and empty. They told us it was probably a prank or some misunderstanding. We pretended to believe that. 2 nights later, my aunt moved out. I stayed behind for a few weeks until I could find a new place. But before I left, I noticed something that made me pause. Our new set of utensils, the ones I'd bought to replace the old ones, were slowly going missing again. Only this time I never bothered looking outside. I remember one cold Friday night 2 years ago when my best friend Hannah texted me out of nowhere. We'd known each other since grade school, so her messages were rarely serious. But this one just said, "He's watching me again." I asked who she meant, but before I could finish typing, another message came in, this time with a photo attached. The image showed her blinds slightly parted. Through the narrow gap, across the dark backyard, a faint yellow glow illuminated a man standing perfectly still in his window. His face wasn't visible, but his posture was straight, his head tilted slightly downward, like he was focused directly on her. The picture gave me chills. I called her instantly. She whispered that she hadn't moved in 10 minutes, afraid he'd notice her. She said he hadn't blinked or shifted once. "He's just standing there," she breathed, "like he's waiting for something." I told her to lock the doors and keep me on speakerphone while I drove over. She just said, "Please hurry." The drive to Hannah's place was only 6 minutes, but that night it felt longer. Every empty streetlight I passed seemed dimmer than usual, the silence thicker. Hannah's voice trembled through the phone, sometimes going quiet mid-sentence, as if she were listening to something. Then she whispered, "He's closer to the glass now." I pressed harder on the gas. She said she'd turned off her bedroom light to make it harder for him to see her, but his window was still lit. "He's not moving," she whispered again, almost to herself. I told her to go into the hallway and stay away from all the windows until I got there. She said okay, but her voice cracked. When I turned onto her street, my stomach dropped. Her house sat near the end of the block, porch light flickering, curtains drawn. The neighbor's house, directly beside hers, was almost completely dark except for that single window, the one she said the man was standing in. From the road, it glowed faintly through the night air. I parked halfway in her driveway and ran to her door. She opened it immediately, eyes wide, face pale like she'd been crying. "He was right there," she whispered, "in the window. But when you turned onto the street, he stepped back." I followed her trembling hand toward the neighbor's window and froze. The window wasn't there anymore. The wall was freshly bricked over, the mortar still wet, like someone had sealed it in just minutes before I arrived. The rest of the house looked old, but that one patch of wall looked new, too new. I couldn't understand how something like that could happen in the time it took me to drive there. Hannah whispered, "It wasn't like that before." Her voice cracked again, and she stepped back from the door. I could tell she wasn't making it up. She was shaking too hard for that. I stared at the wall one more time, the cold air pressing against my back. That's when I noticed the faint smell of drying cement drifting through the yard. The next morning, Hannah looked exhausted. She said she hadn't slept, convinced that if she closed her eyes, she'd see that man again. I tried to calm her down, telling her maybe it was just a reflection or shadow, but she shook her head. "I watched him for 20 minutes, she said. "He was real." I didn't argue, because part of me believed her. We walked over to the neighbor's house later that day. It looked ordinary from the street, faded paint, overgrown bushes, but up close, that wall stood out. The bricks were new and rough, slightly darker than the rest. Hannah swore it hadn't been there the day before. I leaned closer and noticed a thin smear of cement along the siding, still soft. I asked if she knew the guy who lived there. She said his name was Mr. Blakely, a quiet older man who kept to himself. He didn't have family visiting, didn't host anyone, but she'd seen his light on almost every night, always around the same hour. "Sometimes I see him pacing," she said quietly. "Other times, he's just standing there." That afternoon, we decided to knock on his door. Hannah was hesitant, but I thought maybe we could just ask if he'd been doing repairs. No one answered. The blinds were drawn, and the front porch smelled faintly of wet concrete. I turned to leave, but Hannah tugged my sleeve. "Look," she whispered. Near the bottom of the door frame, a trail of fine gray dust led outward. It stretched down the porch steps and faded into the walkway. It looked like cement powder, the kind that clings to your shoes when it's still drying. We followed it a few feet before it disappeared near the edge of her yard. "It's like he was working out here," I said, but the idea didn't make sense. Who bricks a window in the middle of the night? We went back to her kitchen and sat quietly for a while. She kept glancing toward the blinds as if expecting to see movement. Around dusk, she said softly, "That window used to be right across from mine. I could see his table, his clock, everything. Now it's just gone." There was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. Later that night, I stayed over because she didn't want to be alone. We fell asleep on the couch with the TV on low. At some point, I woke up to a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy against brick. I sat up and listened. It came again, slow and steady, from outside the living room window. I moved closer and peeked through the curtain. Across the yard, in the same spot as before, the neighbor's wall glistened faintly in the moonlight. But this time, the surface wasn't flat anymore. I could swear I saw movement, a faint outline pressing outward from behind the new bricks, shifting as if something was trying to breathe through. I froze where I stood, watching the faint movement ripple across the wall. It wasn't constant, more like a slow, uneven pulse beneath the surface of the bricks. My throat went dry. I reached over and shook Hannah awake, whispering her name. When she finally sat up, the sound had stopped, but when she looked toward the window, she went completely still. We both crept closer together. The moonlight caught the texture of the bricks again, and for a split second, I saw a crack form, thin, jagged, right where the center of the wall had bulged. It split just enough to show something darker behind it. Hannah grabbed my arm and backed away, whispering that we needed to leave. But before we could move, a muffled knock came from behind that wall. 3 slow, hollow taps. It wasn't coming from our side. It came from inside the bricked-over space, like someone trapped was knocking to be let out. My stomach turned as I realized what that meant. Hannah covered her mouth and whispered, "He's still in there." I didn't want to believe it, but that sound, that dull, desperate rhythm, didn't stop. I grabbed my phone, trying to record, but before I could open the camera, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then, from the shadows near the fence line, a soft scraping sound started again. Something was moving along the side of her house, slow and deliberate. We ducked down, hearts pounding. Through the narrow gap of the blinds, I saw a faint shape, tall, still, standing where the moonlight barely touched. It was the same outline she had described. It wasn't behind the wall anymore. I could see its head tilt slightly, like it was searching for the window that used to be there. Then it turned toward Hannah's house. We bolted for the back door and ran straight into my car. Hannah's hands shook so badly she dropped her phone. When I looked back, that figure was gone. But the air around that wall looked wrong, almost rippling. We didn't go back until the next afternoon, and when we did, the wall was perfectly smooth again. No cracks, no fresh cement, like nothing had ever been there. A few weeks later, Hannah moved out. She said she couldn't stand living across from that house anymore. I stopped by once after she left, mostly just curiosity, and saw a "for sale" sign on Mr. Blakely's lawn. The curtains were open this time, and for the first time in months I could see inside. The interior looked abandoned except for one thing. Against that same wall, where the bricked window had been, a single chair faced outward. The seat was empty, but the way it was angled, it almost looked like someone had been sitting there watching.